Chassidus' birth, which is why the birthdays of the Baal Shem Tov and the Alter Rebbe are so important. Chai Elul, as we well know, Chai Elul is the birthday of the two great luminaries. The Baal Shem Tov was born on this date in Tafnun Ches, and on Wednesday, Chai Elul Taf Kuf Hey, the Alter Rebbe was born. So Inyan Zeh, Shem Hildosa Shal Tzadik was Manchal Simcha, the principle that a Tzadik's birthday is a time of Simcha is not new. It's something that Chazal speak about frequently, especially Befrat, Gabi Yitzchak Avinu, Moshe Rabbeinu. Those are the two examples we're actually going to have a look at. Ad Gidei Ashwa Befel B'Maaseh Rav. The power and joy of their birthdays is so intense that it even has practical implications. Like the Medrash says, how come it is that the celebration of constructing and putting up the Mishkan was not when it was immediately ready, but it was delayed. Because the Eibishter wanted to wait until Rosh Chodesh Nisan so that we could combine the Simcha of the Mishkan with the Simcha of Yitzchak's birthday. Because Yitzchak was born on Rosh Chodesh Nisan, so therefore the Eibishter says, I'm going to combine multiple Simchas. So you see that Yitzchak Avinu's Simcha of his birth is so powerful that it impacts when the Mishkan was going to be put up. Yes, Sarah Canaan, the most glaring example which we're familiar with, of course, is Matzinu Shem Adosa Shem Moshe Zayin Adar. We know that Moshe Rabbeinu's birthday, the 7th of Adar, was the power needed to dispel and to dissolve Haman's decree. He thought that Adar is a bad time because Moshe Rabbeinu passed away, not realizing it was also the time that Moshe Rabbeinu was born, and therefore that turned around the decree. Despite the beauty and importance of birthdays of tzaddikim, we don't find that the birthdays of great tzaddikim became a day of a Yom Tov and a very public day. There was something that we actually do about it. In fact, to the contrary, sometimes. Technically, Zayin Adar is actually a day of fasting because it's the day of the passing of Moshe Rabbeinu. Yet when it comes to Chai Elul, whole different story. When it comes to the birthdays of the Baal Shem Tov and the Alter Rebbe on Chai Elul, and the Frierdiker Rebbe revealed in the name of his father, the Rebbe Rashab, that Chai Elul is a day of joy. How much joy? To the extent that you actually wish Good Yom Tov. And the Frierdiker Rebbe publicized that to the entire Jewish community. Now, that's obviously precise, because everything related to Torah is absolutely precise. So clearly the joy that is associated with the birthdays of Chai Elul not only because, thanks to the Baal Shem Tov and the Alter Rebbe, there's a whole new perspective on how to serve the Eibishter, which is Gidei Teres Chassidus Aklolis, the general introduction of Chassidus to the Baal Shem Tov, Teres Chassidus Chabad, the Chalal Yisrael, and specifically the teachings of Chabad from the Alter Rebbe. And agam mipnei shechidush in Yinasimcha shebiyom Aledes kosher b'miyuchod the Baal Shem Tov the Rabbeinu Hazaken l'Teres Chassidus sheniskal sal yadam. It's because whatever the joy of a birthday is meant to be, and certainly the birthday of a tzaddik, is highlighted specifically in the case of the Baal Shem Tov and the Alter Rebbe and the Chassidus that they revealed. But yes, al kain, and more specifically, the uniqueness of what they bring to the table in terms of what a birthday is all about is when you put the Alter Rebbe and the Baal Shem Tov together. As the Rebbe Rashab said about Chai Elul, that it's today is the birthday of our two great luminaries. Meaning to say, what makes this particular birthday so unique is it's the fact that the two great luminaries shared a birthday. That it is specifically the harmony, the blend of the Baal Shem Tov and the Alter Rebbe, and that's what we're going to examine in the Sikha, understanding what each of them brought and what Chassidus generally does and how it's related to birth. To get there, let's first ask the question, what is in fact the great simcha of a birthday? Sometimes you think maybe to the contrary. Before the baby is born, when it's still in the womb, he has all the physical elements of the body, including not only limbs but also hair and nails. Not only does he have the pieces of the body, but the body actually does certain of its functions. The body eats from what the mother eats, and drinks what the mother drinks, etc. We know that there's movement in the womb, etc. The truth is, to the contrary, there's an advantage to being unborn. When the fetus is in the mother's womb, in certain respects, the reality of this child is even stronger than when the child is alive. Because the mother's womb protects the child from all kinds of harm. Naturally, because of the mother. Whereas once the baby is born, you have to apply effort in order to keep the baby healthy and safe. Second of all, while the baby is in the uterus, it eats and drinks in an automatic way. Whereas once the baby is born, it takes effort to feed the baby. Sometimes it's uncomfortable for the baby, as we well know. That's physically. Spiritually, the unborn baby is certainly beyond a human. When you're talking about a Jewish person, the spiritual state of the baby before birth seems to be much greater than the person after they're born. As long as the baby's in the womb, there's a spiritual candle over its head, which allows it to be able to gaze from one end of reality to the other. And you teach them the entire Torah. But the moment that baby is born, an angel comes and flicks it on the lip, and he forgets the whole Torah. And then only once the child is old enough to be able to speak, then the parents start to teach. The father has an obligation to teach Torah Tziva. And the various stages of educational development. At 5 you learn the Chumash, at 10 you learn Mishnah. Until eventually you reach the apex of understanding at the age of 40, when you have true understanding. And there are very, very, very few people who ever reach the point that they study the whole Torah. So surely the baby is far better off before it's born. What's the great simcha of the birthday? If you look at it objectively, birth is a tremendous downgrade. So what are we celebrating? To understand that, let's examine the halachic distinction between a fetus and a live child. Like Rashi tells us, as long as the person hasn't yet entered the world, he's not considered a living being. And therefore, if his mother is in danger because of him, we are allowed to sacrifice the fetus in order to save the mother, because it's not truly alive yet. Only once his head emerges into the world, then he's called a living being. And then you can't do anything to spare the mother by getting rid of the fetus, because then it's considered alive. And we don't get to choose one life over another. In other words, yes, the fetus has all of the 248 limbs and the capacity to move. But he's not considered alive. And this is going to be key to what we're talking about. The definition of being alive is that you can't look at the person as two separate entities, a body with some external life support, like an entity inside a container. Rather, what does it mean to be alive? It's a single living entity that is comprised of soul and body. Whereas a fetus, his life force is not his own, it's his mother. He's literally on life support. And therefore he's not considered alive. That is critical to understand the difference between a fetus and a live person. Which is why we have a great simcha annually on the birthday, because this is the celebration of the day when this person became an independently living being who we could call a nefesh. Let's translate that from a metaphor into understanding what Chassidus is all about. That would explain why the celebration and the Yom Tov of a Tzaddik's birthday is specifically in the case of the Baal Shem Tov and the Alter Rebbe, because what a birthday represents is exactly what Chassidus achieved. And specifically, when you take the broad-based Chassidus of the Baal Shem Tov and you put it together with the specific Chabad Chassidus of the Alter Rebbe, then you really get the sense of what birth is all about. Yodua, we know very well, we know that Golus is compared to pregnancy, and the time of Mashiach, which should happen immediately, is like birth. As we well know, Chassidus is a preparation for and a foretaste of the experience of Moshiach. And it's through the spreading of the wellsprings of Chassidus throughout the world that will bring Moshiach, as Moshiach told the Baal Shem Tov. How do you move on? So therefore Chassidus must have aspects to it which are similar to what's going to happen in the time of Geula. In other words, Chassidus is the aspect of birth, in the same way as Geula is birth, and Chassidus is the foretaste of Geula. So you have to see elements of what birth is all about in Chassidus. And how so? Because in the same way as a person could survive in one of two ways, independently or on life support, so the observance of Torah and mitzvahs could also happen in two ways. You could have, there's the person who fulfills Torah mitzvahs and the Torah mitzvahs, two separate entities. The person is obviously a good person who fears heaven, who's very invested in Torah learning, and very strict about keeping even the so-called smallest of mitzvahs. But he's very conscious of self. He is an independent entity from the Torah and mitzvahs that he is committed to. There is a he who studies Torah, and there's a he who fulfills mitzvahs, and that Torah mitzvahs infuses him with life. It becomes his life, the length of his days. Naturally, because what is he ingesting through Torah mitzvahs? The Eibishter's energy, which is absolute life. That's like being a fetus. That even though he has all of the pieces of the puzzle and he is alive, his life is not his own, he is plugged into his mother. Whereas if you have to theoretically look at the fetus per se, it's technically dead, being kept alive by an external force. So a person could be the same way spiritually. So what did the Baal Shem Tov introduce to the world? The Baal Shem Tov taught the deeper meaning of the concept. There's nothing else besides the Eibishter. Not only are there no other forces, no other gods, etc. There's nothing else besides the Eibishter. Therefore, there can never be a possibility of two separate things. A person who is independent, who exists, and also is, Baruch Hashem, dedicated to Torah mitzvahs. That's not possible, because the Baal Shem Tov clarified that there's no existence other than the Eibishter. The only existence is the Eibishter, and the Eibishter's Torah and mitzvahs, because Torah is Hashem's wisdom, which is one with Hashem, and mitzvahs are Hashem's will, which are one with Hashem. Therefore, there's only one reality. What is my life? Torah mitzvahs, not I am alive being fed by Torah mitzvahs. That is my life. But which is similar to once the child is born. We don't say two things were born at birth. There was a body that was born and a neshama that was inserted inside of it. There was a human, which is a single living entity comprised of body and soul. I'm a single living Jew comprised of Torah and mitzvahs. This is emphasized in the Lashon Chazal at the end of the Gemara Kiddushin. I was not created. I don't really exist as an independent entity called human. What was created when I was created? A being, a vehicle that could serve the Eibishter. What is my reality? A servant of the Eibishter. Because in order that a person should actually be able to fulfill Torah mitzvahs, and that's to be humans. If they're no humans, who's going to fulfill Torah mitzvahs? If they're not physical Jewish people, who's going to fulfill Torah mitzvahs? I don't have a reason to exist. But because the Eibishter needs Torah mitzvahs, therefore I'm here. Which means the Baal Shem Tov's perception and what he taught us is, I was not created as me. I was created as a detail in the fulfillment of what the Eibishter wants. The fact that via my actions and behavior, the Eibishter's goals are met. We can relate this to halacha in Hilchos Shabbos, which illustrates the point. Let's say that a person is carrying on Shabbos into a place where you may not carry an amount of food that is less than the kind of food that you would be liable for, because there are measures of how much food a person has to carry on Shabbos in order to be liable. But the person is carrying it inside a container which is large enough that you would be liable for carrying the container. Here's the interesting halacha. If the amount of food inside the container is less than what you'd be liable for on Shabbos, you're not liable for the container either, because the container is accessory to the food. The whole purpose of the container is only to carry the food. Therefore, it actually has no value of its own. That's why the container itself is actually large enough to transgress Shabbos. And if that container had been empty, you'd be transgressing Shabbos by carrying it outside. But now in this context, that container is being used as the container of the food. It loses its own identity, and its entire identity becomes a service to the food. If the food is enough to be liable in Shabbos, the keli is a problem. If not, the keli is as if it doesn't exist. And therefore, in our case, in this case, the amount of food is less than the liable shear. Carrying this container out into the street on Shabbos is as if you didn't carry it at all. Because the whole reason you're carrying the container is because you're interested in the food. The reality of this keli is it now becomes food. And the food is not enough to be liable on Shabbos. Same thing. My whole purpose is to serve the Eibishter. You look at me and you see a person. That's your perception. But halachically, my whole purpose is to serve the Eibishter. Zehu. I don't have another definition. That is the general principle of what Chassidus brought to the world, a realization that we are alive, not supported by external Torah and mitzvahs. And that is even more clearly revealed through Torah Chassidus Chabad. That's why the Chap of Chai Elul is the Shnei HaMa'ores HaGedolim, because they work hand in hand. The innovation, the newness of the reality of a child that's born versus the child that's a fetus, that it becomes now an entity, a living being, is not a generic thing, but it's very specific, related to the specific functioning of the child. It's not just a general principle, okay, now the child is alive. No, you see it in very practical specifics. Because how do you see that when a fetus is in the womb, that it is subsidiary to the mother? You see that primarily because all the specific functions of the body are not yet working. As the Gemara tells us, what would you compare a fetus to while it's in the uterus? Like a ledger that is folded up, because the baby is folded up, its head is between its knees, and it eats what the mother eats, etc. Which means, despite the fact that the fetus has all of the pieces, a head, eyes, ears, they don't work. The head is folded in between the knees. It serves no purpose. Because the baby is not yet able to think. He has eyes, but he cannot see. He has ears, but he cannot hear. So it's not just that he's not alive and now he's alive. He's not functional. The details of his system do not function in the uterus. When he's born, they begin to function. That's the great thing that occurs at birth. Firstly, he is able to live independently, but not only in the generic sense, but all the specifics of his body start to work as they should. Each one independently. He can now see through his own eyes and hear through his own ears. That's why when we translate this metaphor of birth into Chai Elul, we say it's the birth of both the two great luminaries, Baal Shem Tov and the Alter Rebbe together. Because if you understand what the Baal Shem Tov and the Alter Rebbe each brought to the world, you see how it reflects exactly this principle: the life of the child and the specific functioning of the child. Because what is the great edge and innovation of Chassidus Chabad over the Chassidus that the Baal Shem Tov taught? The Baal Shem Tov's objective was to create a generic re-energizing of Torah mitzvahs. By exposing people to their own neshamas, which brought them, so to speak, out of their slumber, as we'll see in a moment. And that primarily expressed itself in declarations and behavior of absolute faith in Hashem. Even though the nature of emunah is that it imbues and infuses all of the facets of the person and every single part of the person, as the pasuk says, that a tzaddik lives with emunah, in other words, it brings him to life. So yes, emunah energizes a person so that their entire behavior is a whole different enthusiastic commitment to Hashem, but that doesn't necessarily drill down into every specific limb. Rather, what you got is this generic energy which happens also to impact every single part of the body. Here's an example. Besides the obvious that we well know, emunah can sometimes be quite abstract from behavior. Like the Gemara tells us, that you got the burglar breaking into the house, davening to the Eibishter that he doesn't get caught, which shows that he has emunah, but the emunah hasn't translated into moral behavior. But it's even more subtle than that. Emunah can directly impact a person that the person behaves in an appropriate manner. It could affect the way he sees things, so that instead of interpreting the world as a physical entity that stands on its own two legs, which could cause the person to perceive that the world is actually an obstacle to spirituality and certainly to godliness. So emunah shifts that vision. So emunah starts to change things that, at least in the mind's eye, even though my physical eye sees the world as an obstacle to Chelek, in the mind's eye I could see it differently. But emunah is not powerful enough that the person can actually discern in the creation the power of the Creator. And that's similar to the general principle that a person is alive. Now they're born, they're alive. Obviously that means that every part of their body is alive. But at that point we're not describing the eye is for seeing and the ear is for hearing and the hand is for moving. But there's this general gushing of life throughout the whole body, so everything comes to life. What the Alter Rebbe did with Chassidus Chabad was to inject life into every single part of the neshama, and to every single form of avodah within Torah mitzvahs. In a way that is relevant and specific to what that part of the body or that part of avodah is all about. Which would be more aligned with the specific energy that flows from the neshama into every part of the body to give it its particular ability. So in other words, the kind of energy that's in the brain has to be totally different to the kind of energy that's in the pinky. This is the example of intellect. Emunah will blind us with this incredible awareness of the Eibishter, and therefore will be enthusiastic to do what the Eibishter wants. Chassidus Chabad will get into the seichel, where we can actually understand and appreciate, firstly, the imperative that there is godliness, which is the only reality and the source of all life, and to actually understand and appreciate what that is. So this way of infusing nefesh into every single part of the person, starting with the intellectual components, which means practically that the person's Chabad appreciates the only reason I have intellect and the various faculties of intellect is to be able to understand the Eibishter. And that then translates into emotional attachment, where our emotions are relative to our intellect. The person becomes conscious. Why is there an element of love in my persona so that I could love the Eibishter? Hainu shenega shekol mitziyosa shom midas ha'ave higedesh tiavas havaya v'aderech ze midas ha'yiro shah midas, and the same will apply to every one of the midas to appreciate and understand why did the Eibishter endow me with this particular midah in order to serve Hashem. That allows every facet of the human being to be alive with this incredible energy of commitment to Hashem in its own right. That the person realizes that the essence of every part of what keeps me alive is Elikus. That's why the Rebbe Rashab defined Chai Elul as the day of the birth of the two great luminaries of ours. Together. And then he extrapolated what each of them represents. Because specifically, when you have the great innovation of Chassidus from the Baal Shem Tov, and then that is translated and explained through Chassidus Chabad, which the Alter Rebbe taught, that is what exposes the greatness of this particular birthday. And how it is directly relevant to each of us, to the extent that we actually feel a real, genuine need to say Good Yom Tov. Because we are conscious of the fact that this is the day that made us truly alive in every single facet of who we are. So, if you want to understand what a tzaddik brings to the world, the first place to identify it is in their Torah. We're going to see this clearly in a particular Torah that was shared by the Baal Shem Tov to the Rebbe Rashab in Tov Reish Nun Beis, that shows not only what Chassidus brings to the world, but specifically the Baal Shem Tov showing what Chassidus Chabad brings to the world. As the Fidik Rebbe relates that his father, the Rebbe Rashab, heard 7 different Torahs that the Baal Shem Tov shared in Gan Eden on that day. This is one of them. As a Torah Harishon on Baal Shem Tov Kabbalah Shabbos, the pasuk, the first one that Baal Shem Tov said just as Shabbos entered on the pasuk at the beginning of the parasha, V'hoya ki savoi el haaretz, when you will come into the land, which is this parasha. Or Pirish, and he explained that Eretz is l'shoin merutz, that the word Eretz over here means to like run or be enthusiastic and energetic. Ki betevas Eretz esh beis pirushim, because there are 2 ways you could translate the word Eretz. So the Medrash tells us there are 2 things. The one is that it's a land that wants to do what the Eibishter wants, and the second Eretz is Lashon Merutza, enthusiasm, impetus. Says the Baal Shem Tov, when you'll come to Oretz, which means when you come to wanting enthusiastically to do what the Eibishter wants, this is what the Eibishter has given you as an inheritance, and you will inherit it. Which means that this incredibly enthusiastic will to do what the Eibishter wants is a gift we were all given. So then, what do you do with the gift? The Torah continues, you have to settle in that land. That's what our avodah has to be. That it should be settled, meaning permanent, part of who we are. And then you take the fruits and you put them into a basket, which means the halbeshas or oiros bekelim, to take the great energies that the Eibishter has given us and to settle them into a sustainable structure. And then the pasuk continues, we'll go to the places, the Baal Shem Tov, that means that there's Hashgacha Pratis that leads us to where we are. That the Eibishter will choose for you, that when a Jew goes to a place, it's not that you choose to go to a place, the Eibishter is leading you to that place, with supernal oversight. And when you get to a certain place, you have to recognize the reason you're there is to manifest godliness, to publicize the Eibishter in the world. Seeing as this is a teaching that the Baal Shem Tov shared on Chai Elul, and it was heard by our Rabbeim, move on, That must be that this is teaching us what the greatness of Chai Elul is. It wasn't stam that the Baal Shem Tov shared it on that particular day because it was related only to the parasha. It must be related to Chai Elul as well. In Yonam Shal Baal Shem Tov Rabbi Azaken, in this Torah, you have the insight into what the Baal Shem Tov and the Alter Rebbe both represent. In fact, we could split what the Baal Shem Tov is telling us over here into two messages. Our first message is the first thing, that there's a gift from the Eibishter that we get to have an enthusiastic will to do what the Eibishter wants. That is that's what Chassidus brought to the world. That's what the Baal Shem Tov did. He woke people up to this enthusiastic commitment to the Eibishter. Exposing that essence of our neshama's enthusiastic connection to the Eibishter, which every single Yid has. That's what Chassidus achieved. Then the Torah introduces a second point, base. What are you supposed to do next once you have been infused with this great inspiration? You have to settle it. You've got to translate all the energy into structure. That's what Chabad is all about. To draw down all that fire of the neshama into something very tangible and real, that the fire, the power of the neshama should be felt in the day-to-day specifics of my reality. The Baal Shem Tov showing us these are not two separate paths. First, he says we have to get to that enthusiastic ratzon to do what the Eibishter wants, and we have to then anchor it in something which is sustainable. That's not how he's saying it. Do this and then do that, but rather what he's saying is when you will get to the land, when you will have your spiritual birth, where you will now feel this tremendous supernal gift that the Eibishter gave every single Jewish person, that enthusiastic will of the neshama. The purpose of what you do is not part two. The whole purpose of this great inspiration is that you should turn it into something sustainable. And when you succeed in that transference, when you succeed in taking that essence of the neshama and bringing it into every facet and piece of our reality, then that is doing what the Eibishter wants. That is what it means to be fully birthed. And that's why the Baal Shem Tov continued that you go to a place led by Hashgacha Pratis. If you arrive in a particular place, it's because the Eibishter wants you to advertise godliness there. Gam dava ze hoin dashkach pratis pirsum elkus b'chomakim shehudi magiai love kosher lisei d'shittas habal Shem Tov. It goes without saying the principle of hashgacha pratis, and that we're in every single place in order to expose godliness. That is a core teaching of the Baal Shem Tov. But how's that linked to how he began this particular teaching? Which is all about bringing down our inspiration and the mirutza of our neshama to actually be something sustainable. How do you link from that to going out and touching the world? So the same piece where this story is records another Torah that the Baal Shem Tov also taught at the same time. And that was later, so to speak, in the evening on Shabbos after davening. This time the Baal Shem Tov repeated what he said before, and then he added, means how does a person access this tremendous gift that the Eibush has given every single one of us? It is through investing tremendous effort in manifesting the Eibush's name, or the Eibush's world, the Eibush in the world. That we have to be willing to sacrifice to advertise the Eibush in this world. Says the Baal Shem Tov. So what do you actually do practically? What is the Mesiras Nefesh? We take bracha or pasuk tefillah. Say a bracha, pasuk tefillah. Now that doesn't yet seem to be clear enough to link the two things which seem to be unrelated. The tremendous gift from on high, which we have to seep down into our reality through our avodah, and the idea of Hashgacha Pratis taking us places in order to advertise godliness. The fact that the Rishima notes that the Baal Shem Tov repeated the same Torah and then added to it implies sounds like the second thing is its own independent teaching, not just explaining further what he had already said. Void. The second Torah only seems to clarify the part about going and advertising the Eibishter in the world, that we have to be willing to sacrifice to do so. And how that links to the fact that the Eibishter gave us this tremendous gift. Because that tells us really what the Baal Shem Tov introduced to the world. But where's the link between the Mesiras Nefesh to be Mefarsim and in the world and the idea of taking the Matana which the Eibishter gave us and made it be Hisyashvus for us? To translate the great energy into structure, the concept of Teres Chassidus Chabad, which we've identified. The explanation is this. As noted, there's a massive difference between a fetus and a child who's alive. That's not only something which makes a difference to the child. Obviously it does. As we've noted, the fetus doesn't have function and the living child does. But you have to also consider that with regards to others, there's a massive difference between a fetus and a living child. As long as the child is a fetus, everything the child does can only benefit the child. And has absolutely no impact on the world out there. Whereas once a person is born, whatever the child does has an impact on his surroundings. From the moment he's born, as soon as you hear him crying, there's an impact on everybody around him. And he moves his hands, he moves his feet, everybody's looking and saying, oh, he moved, he did this, his eyes are open, eyes are closed, etc. There's now an impact on the broader environment. So now if we're going to translate that metaphor into our spirituality and say that being birthed means to take all of that power and energy that is the gift given to us and translate it into our own behavior and every facet of our behavior, that naturally impacts the environment and helps us to express godliness. That the person now realizes, wherever I am here to have an impact. I'm here to advertise godliness. And there's a spiritual reason for this. The fundamental difference between something that is plugged into an external power source and something that is independently alive is that if you're plugged into somebody else, you can't give life to another. But only if you are actually alive are you in a position to share life. So somebody, God forbid, on life support cannot do anything for other people. If you're logged into the Wi-Fi, you cannot be a mobile hotspot. But when you're truly alive, then you engage with somebody else, you infuse them with life. Because Elikus is absolute life, and that translates and is expressed to Torah mitzvahs. When Torah mitzvahs becomes my life, not just what I do, what I subscribe to, what I learn. This becomes my nefesh. Then naturally, wherever I go, I am radiating godliness. I'm expressing godliness wherever I go. Now, even though the principle of revealing godliness in the world is something that the Baal Shem Tov began before there was Chassidus Chabad through the Alter Rebbe. Still, but in the same way as we've already identified that Chassidus Chabad impacts how the godliness affects every facet of our being, we start to understand, and therefore that affects our emotions, which obviously affects our behavior. In the same way, revealing godliness to the world is different now that there's Chassidus Chabad in the world. When we can take all of the great supernal ideals and translate them into reality. Let's explain. החידוש והתוספת של רבינו הזקן על ידי תרס חסידוס חב"ד אינו רק מצד מיילס כיחס חב"ד של האדם על פני שאר כיחס הנפש. The greatness of Chassidus Chabad is not only to illustrate that the intellectual abilities of the human are far greater than the other abilities of the human. Which is why it is so important that all of the principles and concepts of Chassidus should actually get into the Chabad of a person, because that's the apex, that's the premium part of who the human being is. That's true, but that's not the whole story. But really, the purpose is because the Eibishter wants us to manifest godliness in our world to the extent that it becomes His home. That in the entire world, everybody should be absolutely conscious of the fact there's nothing else besides the Eibishter. That should seep into every facet of the world with a recognition from the world's perspective, not superimposed by some kind of great spiritual entity. Now, because the first thing that distinguishes a person to believe that they may be separate from the Eibishter is their own intellect. Then the first place where we have to explain the concept of Eino Melvado is in the human brain, because the human brain is the first part that's going to say, you know what, I also have an opinion, I also have a reason to be taken seriously. But when a person's intellect is able to acknowledge and understand and appreciate Ein Oid Melvado, to the extent that it is so pervasive that is what my whole mind is only focused on, that Ein Oid Melvado. That will then, as the pasuk says, influence the heart. That intellectual capital will be translated into my emotional sensitivities. Because the most mature form of emotion is emotion that is cultivated and guided by seichel. As the Rambam says clearly in Halacha, how does a person get to a point of loving and fearing the Eibishter? By deep contemplative intellectual development. And then through that it will affect the other parts of the human being, thought processes, the way we speak, how we behave, until eventually we can create an awareness of the Eibishter's oneness throughout the whole world. But where does it all begin? In our own seichel. So therefore, when this idea of expressing godliness in the world is guided by the added insight of Chassidus Chabad, to take these broad, powerful ideals and spiritual concepts and tether them into actual structure, it makes a difference to everything, to the person, to the world. The impact on the person is when do you see that this great, powerful commitment and energy from the person's neshama to the Eibishter, which translates through their seichel? How can you tell that it's real? And it's not just because I'm enjoying it, I like this, I appreciate it, but it's actually Eibishter. When do you see it? Where do you see, what's the evidence that a person is completely connected to the Eibishter? Is willing to compromise self-development, that I should understand Elikus more deeply, or I should develop a more mature love and fear of the Eibishter, but instead goes out there to impact the world. Then you know that this person is living Ein Oid Melvado. It's not about me, it's not about my spiritual development, it's about doing what the Eibishter wants. And you'll see this not only in the person, but also in the work that they do. Just as we know, obviously, in order to advertise the Eibishter in the world, it has to be something which impacts all the various components of the person's neshama. That you should expose and teach Eibishter through intellectual means, and through emotional attachment, and all the various other components of the human being, right all the way down to practice. Anochas tefillin and mazulas, putting tefillin on another Jew, because that is mefarsim elikus. Kvias mezuzah bepesach beisay, putting up a mezuzah on another Jew's door. Vaderech ze b'shar mitzvahs as well as all the other mitzvahs. Al derech ze nidresh lenatzel kol em tzoi v'oifen lefarsim, kol em tzoi v'oifen lefarsim elikus lefi amatzav amiyuchot shebechol zman v'chol mokem. The message is that teaches us that we have to capitalize on every single means and technology at our disposal to spread the Eibishter's word, to spread the consciousness of the Eibishter as is suitable to the particular time in which we find ourselves. Which then takes that particular technology or that particular tool and elevates it to godliness. Because we're then illustrating the truth, which is that every single thing, including every single form of technology, was only created for the Eibishter's glory. Which will explain why we got to hear this Torah of the Baal Shem Tov dafka through the Frierdiker Rebbe. Because look at the Frierdiker Rebbe's life, and you could see clearly how the Eibishter through Hashgacha Pratis led him to all various different types of places, and in each case to reveal godliness, practically. And not only where the Frierdiker Rebbe went personally, but in the entire world, particularly because he sent shluchim all over the entire world. And obviously we can understand that what the Rebbe is saying over here about the Frierdiker Rebbe reflects back on himself. And the way that the Frierdiker Rebbe revealed Chassidus and Elikus in the world was through every possible method. On the one hand, teaching Chassidus the deepest principles of Chassidus, as well as publicizing and printing and publishing Torah, both Nigla and Chassidus, in many languages, even in the most simplistic language for people who had no background in Judaism, to the extent that he impacted Jews to start keeping Shabbos, to start keeping Taras and Mishpacha, to start putting on Tefillin. That impacts that Jew to realize he is now birthed. He's no longer a fetus. He comes alive as a Jewish person. He's alive. He suddenly realizes, you know what my reality is? My reality is Torah mitzvahs. And that speeds the arrival of Mashiach. When Mashiach comes, that will be the ultimate birth of the Jewish people, as we already learnt that Golus is compared to pregnancy and Geula is compared to birth. That Tzion gives birth to her children. We should immediately be zeicha to see that Giloi with Mashiach now.